I moved into the old house at the edge of town because it was cheap, the kind of deal that makes you think something must be wrong. But I needed a fresh start, and I wasn't in a position to be picky. The house was big, too big for someone living alone, but it felt like an escape from the mess of my life. Or so I thought. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. No creaks, no groans. Just the unsettling stillness of an old house that had been empty for too long. I convinced myself it was a good thing, a sign that the place wasn't falling apart. I unpacked, got a few things in order, and went to bed. It was around midnight when I heard it, soft at first, barely noticeable. A faint sound coming from the walls. Took me a while to figure out what it was. At first, I thought it was the wind or the house settling, but it didn't stop. It grew clearer as I lay in the dark, the blankets pulled up to my chin. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of someone crying. A woman. The crying was soft, almost like a whimper, but it was constant. It echoed through the house, seeping into the walls, filling every corner of the room. I listened for a long time, my body stiff with fear, but nothing else happened. No footsteps, no doors creaking open, just that endless, heart-wrenching sobbing. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the crying had stopped. I convinced myself it had been a dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by exhaustion and the stress of the move. But deep down, I knew better. Something was off about this place. The next day, I decided to ask the neighbors about the house. There weren't many people living nearby, just a few older folks who had been in the area for decades. I met an old woman named Mrs. Klein, who lived down the road. She seemed nice enough, but when I mentioned the house, her expression darkened. "You bought the Fletcher house?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded. She looked away, shaking her head. "That house, it's not right. Hasn't been since poor Margaret Fletcher died. It's been empty ever since." "Margaret Fletcher?" I asked. "Years ago," she said. "She lived there with her husband. He was a mean man, cruel to her. One night, he beat her so bad she couldn't take it anymore. They say she ran out into the woods, and they found her body the next morning, down by the river. She drowned herself. Since then, well, no one stays in that house for long." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why not?" Mrs. Klein glanced at the house, then back at me. "People say they hear her, crying, every night." I didn't tell her about the crying I had heard. I didn't want to admit that she might be right. That night, the crying started again. It began as it had the night before, soft, almost imperceptible. But this time I knew it was real. It wasn't a dream. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the walls, rising and falling like the tide. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but the sound seeped into my mind, refusing to be drowned out. There was something so sorrowful, so hopeless about it, like the sound of someone trapped in an eternal grief. It clawed at my nerves, making my skin prickle with unease. Couldn't sleep. The crying continued for hours, a constant, mournful wail that grew louder as the night wore on. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know more. I had to understand why this was happening. The next day, I spent hours researching Margaret Fletcher. I found old newspaper clippings, stories about her death, and about her husband, Henry. He had been abusive, that much was clear, but there were rumors that Margaret's death hadn't been a suicide. Some believed Henry had followed her into the woods that night, drowning her in the river and making it look like she had taken her own life. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew one thing. Margaret's spirit hadn't left the house. That night, the crying started earlier. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when I heard it, a soft sobbing right behind me. She was there, a woman's face, pale and gaunt, with hollow, tear-filled eyes staring back at me from the reflection. Her long, wet hair clung to her face, and her lips trembled as she wept. Her sadness, her pain was palpable. I could feel it deep in my bones. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. But the crying never stopped. I don't know how long I can stay here. Every night, the crying gets louder, more desperate, more sorrowful. It's as if Margaret is trying to tell me something, to show me her pain. But there's nothing I can do to help her. I can't ease her suffering, and I can't escape it. The crying follows me. It's in the walls, in the floor, in the very air I breathe. It chills me to the core, makes my skin crawl, and fills me with a dread I can't shake. Margaret Fletcher isn't a threat. She doesn't mean me any harm, I know that. But the sound of her endless weeping, her eternal grief, it's more than I can bear. I don't know what happened to her that night by the river, whether she took her own life or whether her husband had a hand in it. But one thing is certain. Margaret's spirit is trapped here, bound to this house by her sorrow. And as long as I stay, I'll never know peace. I had made up my mind to leave, but as I began packing my things, I felt a strange reluctance. Something inside me resisted the idea of abandoning the house so quickly. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was guilt. Guilt for leaving Margaret behind in her sorrow, knowing her spirit would continue to cry, alone and unheard. I stood in the living room, staring at the walls. Her crying hadn't started yet, but the silence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. I kept telling myself to move, to grab my bags and just go. But something rooted me in place. It was like the house didn't want me to leave. Then I heard it again, a faint sob echoing from the far end of the hall. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as the sobbing grew louder, filling the air with that familiar, heart-wrenching sound. But this time something was different. The crying wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the cellar. I'd never gone down there. The idea of it had always made me uneasy, but now it was as if Margaret was calling to me, pulling me towards the one place I had avoided. I hesitated, gripping the doorknob to the cellar stairs, my hand trembling. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice shaky. "What do you want?" The crying didn't stop, didn't change, but I felt a pull, a compulsion to go down there. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. The air was colder down there, damp and heavy. As I descended the creaky wooden stairs, the sobbing grew louder, more distinct, until it seemed to echo from every dark corner of the cellar. My flashlight flickered as I reached the bottom, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The cellar was bare, except for an old furnace and a few dusty shelves. I scanned the room, expecting to see something, anything, but it was just an empty, forgotten space. Then I saw it. In the far corner, there was a small door I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates. The door was ancient, made of rough, weathered wood, and barely large enough for a person to crawl through. It didn't belong there, not in a house like this. I couldn't imagine what it led to. The crying seemed to come from behind that door now, more desperate, more urgent. I stepped closer, my breath quickening. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of darkness beyond. I knelt down, gripping the edge of the door, and pulled it open. The smell hit me first, damp earth, cold and stale. Then, through the beam of my flashlight, I saw the dirt floor beyond. It was a crawl space just large enough to fit a person. But there, half buried in the earth, was a skeletal hand. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart racing. The hand, pale and brittle with age, protruded from the dirt, frozen in a gesture of anguish. The earth around it was disturbed, as if someone or something had been clawing its way out. It was Margaret. I didn't need anyone to tell me. I knew. Somehow, in those dark moments, the truth settled in my bones. This was where she had been buried. Not by the river, but here beneath the house. Her endless crying wasn't just grief. It was a call for someone to find her, to set her free. I knelt beside the grave, my hands shaking. "I'm so sorry." The crying intensified, but this time it wasn't the same heart-wrenching sob I had heard night after night. It was louder, closer, almost as if it were filling the very air around me. I could feel her presence, heavy and sorrowful, pressing in on me. I wasn't some kind of medium, and I had no idea how to release a spirit. But I knew one thing. She couldn't stay here, buried in this hidden corner of the cellar, her soul tied to the horrors of her past. I grabbed the nearest shovel I could find and began to dig. The soil was cold and thick, but I worked quickly, desperate to free her remains. As I uncovered more of the skeleton, the crying grew softer, as if she knew she was finally being found. Hours passed, and by the time I had finished, the sun was rising. Margaret's remains lay fully exposed, fragile bones tangled in the earth. Her crying had ceased, replaced by a profound, eerie silence that filled the cellar. I stood over her grave, exhausted, unsure of what to do next. I knew I couldn't leave her there, but it wasn't like I could call the police and tell them I'd found a ghost's grave. Still, I had to give her peace. With trembling hands, I gathered her bones as carefully as I could, wrapping them in an old cloth I had found. I carried her out of the cellar, out of the house, and down to the river where she had been thought to rest all these years. As I stood by the water's edge, I whispered a prayer for her, a prayer that she would finally find peace. Then, I gently placed her remains into the flowing river, watching as they drifted away. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the water and the rustling of the trees. And then, a soft breeze brushed against my cheek, carrying with it the faintest hint of a sigh. Not a cry, but something almost like relief. Margaret was gone. The house feels different now. The silence is no longer oppressive, no longer filled with sorrow. It's just quiet, peaceful. I stayed for a few more days after that, just to be sure, but the crying never returned. I don't know where Margaret's spirit went. Maybe she's finally at rest, free from the torment that bound her to this place. Or maybe she's just somewhere else now, far from the pain of her past. But I like to believe that, in the end, she found the peace she deserved. As for me, I'm leaving the house behind. It's not haunted anymore, but it's no longer my place. It never really was. I'll never forget the sound of her crying, though. That sorrow, that deep, endless pain. It still lingers in the back of my mind. But now there's a quiet, too. A calm that tells me everything's finally as it should be. Margaret Fletcher's tears are no more. As I packed my last bag, I couldn't help but pause and look around the house one final time. It was strange, how different it felt, now that the weight of her sorrow was gone. The oppressive heaviness that had clung to every wall, every corner, had lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost gentle. I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like I could breathe here. And though I knew it was time for me to leave, a part of me swelled with pride, a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in a long time. I had helped her, Margaret Fletcher, this forgotten woman, whose suffering had echoed through the halls of this house for years, was finally at peace. And it was because of me. I had done something no one else had. I had listened. I had faced the fear that others had run from, and I had given her the release she so desperately needed. There's a quiet satisfaction in that, in knowing that I hadn't just abandoned her. I hadn't treated her like some cursed ghost or malicious spirit to run from. She wasn't a danger, just a soul bound by her grief. And in a way, I'd been bound by my own, too. Helping her gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. A purpose. I'd come to this house to escape my own problems, to hide from the chaos my life had become. But in helping Margaret find peace, I found a kind of peace myself. It's strange how things work out that way, how the things we fear can lead to something so unexpectedly good. As I locked the front door for the last time, I felt a wave of finality wash over me. I stood there, my hand resting on the doorframe, and smiled to myself. I wasn't running away anymore. Not from this house and not from my life. I was leaving on my own terms, and that made all the difference. The Margaret Fletcher that cried in the walls wasn't some distant, tragic figure to me anymore. She felt real. Her story, her pain, had become a part of me in a way I couldn't explain. And knowing I had helped her move on, knowing I had played a part in finally setting her free, that filled me with a sense of pride I didn't expect. For so long, I had been lost, uncertain of my place in the world. But now I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. I had given peace to a spirit that had been trapped in endless sorrow for decades. And that meant maybe I could find peace for myself, too. Hope that I could rebuild my life. Hope that, just as Margaret had found her way, so would I. And in the back of my mind, I knew that wherever Margaret was now, she had finally found her peace. And I was proud to have helped her get there. As I walked down the road, away from the house for the last time, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. Not just in the house, but in me. When I first moved in, I was broken, running from my past, from the mess I'd made of things. The house had felt like a temporary refuge, a place to hide. But now I was leaving different, lighter. It wasn't just about helping Margaret, though that had been the most profound part. It was about proving to myself that I could face the unknown, that I could take something terrifying and transform it into something meaningful. I had gone through nights of fear, of feeling helpless in the face of something I didn't understand. But in the end, I hadn't backed down.
Y de estalla.
I'd listened, and because of that, Margaret was free. It made me think about my own life, the things I had avoided, the pain I had buried deep down, hoping it would disappear if I just ignored it long enough. But now, I realized that running from it had only made it worse. The same way Margaret's spirit had been trapped by her grief, I had been trapped by mine. Maybe that was why I couldn't just leave when I first heard her crying. Maybe I'd recognized something familiar in her suffering, something I hadn't been ready to face in myself. But now I understood, helping her was also a way of helping myself. The sun was setting by the time I reached the edge of town, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. I stopped for a moment, just to take it in. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about what had gone wrong in my life. I wasn't weighed down by guilt or regret. Instead, I felt ready to start again. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. My life was still full of uncertainties, and I had a lot of things to work through. But now I felt like I could handle it. I had faced something far more terrifying than any personal failure, and I had come out on the other side stronger. As I stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade, I smiled. Margaret's story had ended, but mine was just beginning. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a future. And it wasn't about escaping or hiding anymore. It was about living, truly living, and finding my own peace along the way, just like Margaret had.